Okay, we're going to start again this afternoon.
I'm going to cover everything.
I think it was a very useful morning, which raised a lot of issues, and probably everybody's kind of chomping at the bit to get into this issue, that issue, and that issue. And hopefully over the next few days we will have time to discuss all of them. But what we wanted to do now after lunch is just give us a chance to look at the overall framework. So we've seen the international examples of public utilities, what's happening in the energy sector. So we thought it would be useful now just to give an overview of the South African political economy, particularly as it relates to the energy sector, so that we're just placing ourselves in context for a discussion around public utilities. So I'm going to hand over to Brian Ashley, Director of AIDC. Most, if not everybody, knows him, to give the first input.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Maybe we should start by saying, Panzi IPPs, Panzi. Down with IPPs, down. I think it was extremely encouraging this morning's sessions, the two sessions that we had. And I think it's important because it puts away the idea of getting caught up in a whole set of false debates, that we didn't have to get into a discussion as to whether NUMSA, NUM and others are simply defending jobs at the expense of the environment, at the expense of having to deal with climate change, having to deal with all the problems of the externalities of mining and the legacy of the mineral energy complex that we have in South Africa. So I want to just say, I just want to talk about a few things about the current context in South Africa. I'm hopefully leaving space for Caroline to speak more specifically about the energy sector. And I hope you don't mind if I sit and talk and kind of look at some notes that I tried to put together. I think the first point for us to take into account, let me start somewhere else actually. I think the most important starting point is that we should congratulate our NUMSA and NUM comrades, because they just won what I think is quite a big victory at Eskom. They concluded a wage negotiations, which was extremely difficult, where Eskom opening offer was a 0% increase. In other words, a cut in wages. NUMSA, and together with NUM, and I suppose with Solidarity as well, won a 7.5% increase. So quite significantly above inflation. So comrades, well done. But it highlights the economy of Eskom, and it highlights the economy in the current situation that we are facing in South Africa. And Eskom's opening offer of 0% was a reflection of the deep financial crisis that Eskom is in, and an expression of the profound crisis of the South African economy. And I think often we would talk about the South African economy being in crisis, and we'll talk about, stagnant growth, 1.6% since, average economic growth of since 2009 to 2017. So it's a very stagnant economy that we're experiencing. But I'd like to suggest that those are the wrong figures. Now, what actually we should be talking about, and which has been mentioned in the earlier session, is the mass unemployment crisis that we have in this country. And just for us, just to refresh us, what are we talking about? Because South Africa talks about an unemployment crisis of 27.2%. 2%. But that excludes 2.6 million workers who are regarded as discouraged workers. They've given up looking for work. They see absolutely no hope of finding employment. They don't go and look for work. And when we include them, we get to an unemployment level of 37.6%. Can you imagine, Sam, 37.6% unemployment in the UK? What happens under those conditions? But worse than that, and I just want to highlight this for comrades because it's extremely important for us to interrogate these statistics of Stats South Africa and the quarterly labour force survey, because they have a very interesting category amongst the not economically active. So discouraged workers are not economically active and therefore not in the official unemployment level. But there's a category called homemakers. 2.5 million people are considered homemakers in South Africa, where the average monthly income per person is 992 Rand. So I'm sure that there are lots of women who can afford to be at home and look after the house and look after the children and not look for work. In other words, what I'm saying is a large percentage of the 2.5 million people that are designated as homemakers are actually unemployed women, mostly trapped in the Bantustans. And that brings me to the fundamental problem of the South African economy, and that is the very deep level of inequality in our society. So people have heard the statistics of when you measure inequality using the Gini coefficient, where 0 represents absolute equality and 1 represents absolute inequality. We hover between 0.64 and 7. So the highest level of inequality at the moment measured in the world. But I think that underestimates coming to grips with the level of unemployment, because when we look at income, 10% of the population earn 60% of the total income in South Africa. And worse than that, they say 10% of the population own 90 to 95% of the assets. This is 20 to 25 years after the ending of apartheid, which was supposed to be a transition based on the redistribution of wealth. In fact, what has happened has been quite the opposite. In fact, we have redistributed wealth, but from the poor to the rich, and not from the rich to the poor. That's what the statistics in South Africa are telling us. And we have to account for that. And very often in these debates and in these settings, we talk about the neoliberal policies of the government. And that's relevant and correct, but I think it misses the point of what those with these assets, the 10% of the population with this will own the 95%, what have they been doing over the last 20 to 25 years? What they have been doing is essentially taking their money out of this country and investing in mostly financial assets abroad. And we can talk about a huge outflow of capital that has taken place. And the context for that outflow of capital from South Africa, which is a story of what has happened over the last 20 odd years, is the erosion of the core accumulation strategy that shaped the South African economy, and which many of us talk in terms of the so-called mineral energy complex, or the mineral energy financial complex as it evolves post-1994. In other words, it refers to the way in which big conglomerates, the Anglos, the Glencores and BHP Billitons, etc., all of these big corporations that grew up in the mining and mineral beneficiation sectors, they not only became miners and processors of minerals, they also financialized. They also became lenders of money on a big scale. Just to use another analogy, Woolworths is more probably today a financial company than a retailer in the way in which it is earning huge amounts of money from charging all of us interest on using that lovely card they give us so freely. So this is the same phenomena that has happened within the South African economy, and I think it's important to highlight, because we too often focus on government and not on capital, not on big business. And what we see happening has been, of course, facilitated. The export of this capital was facilitated by policy, and we will talk about the role of Trevor Manuel and Tito Mboweni when he was governor of the Reserve Bank, and allowed these corporations to take their primary listing out of South Africa and go to London and Melbourne and New York, etc., etc. But I think it's important to highlight that, because these corporations and these conglomerates, which were trapped inside the South African economy because of the way the mineral energy complex was structured, and also because of the international context of sanctions and disinvestment and so on, with the ending of apartheid, what they did essentially was to globalize and restructure. And that was made possible, of course, by what we did in terms of liberalizing South African economy, both the financial side and the trade sectors and so on. And this introduced something that is very prevalent and very determining in the economic situation that we face today, and that is that in order to finance our imports of fuel and other things that we import, of course, we had to seek investment, foreign investment. And that investment, remember GEAR, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution strategy, which was our homegrown, if you like, structural adjustment program, where we privatized, we cut government spending, we reduced taxation and all of those things. That GEAR was predicated on resolving a deep debt crisis by attracting foreign investment into the South African economy. So I can see why you were praising Comrade Zweli for his fortitude in not drinking water.
You did tell us a camel story.
Sorry?
Told us a camel story.
Wow, right now.
I can't forget that story. It's so well told.
I won't compete then. So I think when we look at the current political situation and the recent political transition, I think it's extremely interesting to see the analogies and the similarities with that previous period. Because the point that I'm wanting to make at the moment is that South Africa has slipped back into a very deep debt crisis that is confronting the country at the moment. And I was saying to Makoma, who we were together in a campaign for the cancellation of apartheid debt, it's almost going back to that type of campaign, but this time we've got to deal with much deeper issues, in the sense that the big story about the South African political economy over the last 20 years is just how financialized it has become, and how credit has become the means to deal with the deficit of this huge inequality situation and impoverishment that has taken place. And to ensure that people continue to be able to consume, people are offered easy credit. And so we have a massive consumer debt crisis in this country, of household debt of enormous proportions, which we possibly could go into afterwards. But the point that I'm wanting to make is that we have a situation in which, in the last medium-term budget policy statement, a previous finance minister, who I think was forced to be more honest than he perhaps wanted to, had to say to us that the debt situation in South Africa has become unsustainable, and that at the moment, with a 53% of GDP debt running to 60% by 2020-21, we are in a point of a deep debt crisis. But equally similar to the situation of the gear period is the talk of sacrificing everything around attracting foreign investment. And so I almost said Thabo Mbeki, but I mean Cyril Ramaphosa has identified the target of attracting $100 billion over the next 5 years. And we need to ask ourselves, what is the consequence of that? Because on the 3rd and 4th of October, or is it the 4th and 5th of October, we are going to have a job summit. And in that job summit, most of us who may want to go there and talk about this high level of unemployment and what needs to be done and the transition to a job creating strategy, is going to be confronted by the talk that the way to create jobs is economic growth, and the way to get economic growth is attracting foreign investment. And I want to suggest that that is completely the wrong paradigm, and it bedevils the discussion that we're having around the Eskom crisis and how to get out of the Eskom crisis. So with a state-owned enterprise debt of 700 billion rand, these are the 9 state-owned enterprises, 700 billion rand, which doesn't include the 400 billion Eskom debt. We have a situation today when we take household debt and business debt, a debt of well over 2 trillion rand. And this is why we have the credit rating agencies breathing down our neck and determining the kind of economic policies that we should be following. And the credit rating agencies are saying, one of the things that you're going to have to do to escape junk status is you're going to have to cut the public sector wage bill. Hence my congratulation of NUMSA and NUM of securing 7.5%, because it bucks the trend where they're wanting to go to. But where they are going to is to cut employment. And that is the next struggle we're going to face, I think, in Eskom. Because initially they spoke about 14,000 jobs that they were going to cut. But because of the obvious hostility of the unions and, you know, in the context of wage bargaining, they say, well, what's going to happen is they're just going to allow jobs to go through natural attrition. Is that the term they use? But there's going to be, just as there is in the public sector, a major push to cut jobs, given the depth of the economic crisis and the depth of the debt crisis, financial crisis that we're facing. And I want to just perhaps say something about the problem of the credit rating agencies and the impact that they have on economic policies. Because as you well know, Finch and Stanley and Poor cut the credit rating agents of our sovereign debt to junk status. Only Moody's has retained an investment grade, not a positive investment grade, but a negative investment grade. Should Moody's cut, what it will mean is that a tremendous amount of investment will flow out of the country. Now, take this current situation that we're facing. Over the last 8 months, from the beginning of this year to the current situation, we've already lost 20% of the value of the rand against the dollar. Most of that was not in relation to domestic issues. It wasn't a response to the sacking of finance ministers as happened last year or something like that. It's got to do with the trade war between the US and China, its impact on emerging economies, and blah, blah, blah. But 20%, and we have a credit rating downgrade, and the impact is going to be extremely severe. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the discussion that we're having on Eskom, which is already been given junk status and has a huge bond debt to credit institutions in different parts of the world, is that the many people are correct in saying that this vertically integrated public utility that we've got is going to have to be broken up and possibly privatized in order to deal with the financial crisis of Eskom. And don't expect us as Eskom to be the ones allocating more investment in building a renewable energy industry. And perhaps I should quote just recently, somebody I thought we should invite to this conference, Anton Eberhardt, when he was speaking just last month, he was saying, at an event hosted in Johannesburg by something called EE Publishers and the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers. He said, vertically integrated utility model was no longer fit for purpose, particularly in light of the unprecedented rate of change currently underway across the global electricity industry. So we're up against our perspective, which Sean and others were addressing in the last session about centering our strategy around the public utility that remains in control of generation, transmission, distribution, etc., that we retain those capacities, and we see the importance of that in the light of the failure of privatization models, etc., that have taken place internationally. Here we have a very strong sense that this must go, that must be broken up. It's not feasible any longer, and this lies behind Praveen Gordhan's instruction to Eskom to develop Strategy 2035, which should look at a restructuring of Eskom to make it financially feasible and viable. So, of course, the link between Eskom and the mining sector and the big energy intensive users in South Africa is an extremely important one, because these 30-odd corporations consume something like 44% of energy consumption in South Africa. And it's unlikely, and in no case up to now, whether it was the development of the integrated resource plan or any other strategy, whether it even came to our climate mitigation strategy, where the big energy users were not behind the scene determining the policies that we have. And so in a context of a deep financial crisis, in a context in which we have major mining corporations that have restructured themselves as global transnational corporations, where South Africa is just now a bit player. So think about Anglo American as an example, which in the late 1980s controlled something like 60% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is way under 10% today, and which has recently announced a massive restructuring, both globally and in South Africa, whereby they are going to reduce their interest to diamonds, platinum, and iron ore. The rest they are getting out of, and increasingly divesting from South Africa. And that gives us the context of a substantial deindustrializing of the core parts of the South African economy. And it's in this context that we have to think about an alternative industrial strategy as we confront the erosion and coming apart of an accumulation strategy which was based upon cheap electricity and the linkage between the energy and mineral and mining sectors of this economy. So just as they say, a good crisis is a good opportunity for us to rethink a whole range of things. We are at that point where the opportunity exists for us to think about a different type of industrial strategy. And it's in this context that we've got to look at and think about Eskom's role. And Eskom, if it is going to play a role, has to be at the forefront of driving what we have termed a low carbon development strategy. And that low carbon development strategy is part of it is about decarbonizing the energy sector. But there we've got to think about transition. We've got to think about how do we do that without us destroying even more jobs, because currently we are facing a massive jobs bloodbath. And SAFTU and other unions have highlighted that up to 70,000 jobs are at stake. Now, it's impossible for us to start advocating a transition which is going to be at the expense of more jobs. So we've got to think about what can be this concretely, what is this alternative industrial strategy? What are the basis of its viability, etc.? Because I don't think we can speak in general terms any longer. We've got to be very concrete in being able to answer. I would just leave you with one last point, and that is, when we talk about transition, when we talk about anything alternative, we're always confronted with the question, where's the money going to come from? I would draw your attention to the last, I think it's the last chapter in the Climate Jobs book that's in your folder, where we try to answer that. And one of the things that I want to pick up, there are many opportunities for rethinking our tax strategy and policy. And I'm not even going to talk about the 30 billion US dollars that illicitly flows out of this country and putting a stop to that. I'm not going to talk about the 50 billion rand that goes out in mythical management and marketing fees that the transnational here in South Africa pays its subsidiary in Bahamas where it doesn't pay tax, etc. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the opportunities for taxing high income earners. for taxing corporations as they should, because we have a situation where the vast majority of the wealthy, the vast majority of high net income earners are not paying any tax. And we've got to do that, and that puts the issue of reclaiming SARS as a very important part of what we're on about. And secondly, I want to just draw your attention to the Public Investment Corporation that Comrade Bharvi and others mentioned today. Because the Public Investment Corporation manages in two important institutions. It manages the Government Employees Pension Fund, and it manages the UIF. Both of these funds have massive surpluses in it, massive. What I'm talking about in the Public Investment Commission is a corporation which has assets of over 2 trillion rand today, surpluses of between 150 to 170 billion rand. We can deal with Eskom's financial crisis by using those resources, and it doesn't cost one pensioner any risk, because the government employees' pension are defined benefits. So it's independent of what is in the pool of money. So the question that we should be asking is, what should we do in terms of, as a working class constituencies, how should these public monies be utilized in the best interest of facilitating a transition to a low carbon, wage-led development path? That's just one. We can say the same of the more than 100 billion rand surpluses in the UIF. When you have such levels of unemployment, how can it be that we have surpluses in the UIF, and where are they being used? Where are they being directed? They've been directed to facilitate Black economic empowerment in its most narrow and predatory sense, as we've seen with our friends like Brian Molefe and others. So I think there's lots of space to think about the possibility in using this crisis to urgently take the transition from a failed and eroding accumulation strategy. And that is why the shift that we're talking about, the just transition, is more than about decarbonizing an energy sector. It's more than just going renewable. It's about a different transition, a different type of system that we urgently need, because we have this social crisis of a mass unemployment crisis where the social fabric has collapsed and where we can already see many instances of barbarism. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. I think that's been very useful. Caroline, do you want to just add a little bit to that, just from the perspective? Caroline comes from Woman, so maybe just to add a few points, and then we can open it up for discussion.
I think that we can open up for discussion because it's not important actually, but I will, because we don't have enough time, and then I'll just go into the conclusion of what I wanted to present. Is that South Africa Energy Plan is scarcely recognizing its climate pledge, and so for me, I wanted to talk about how government must stop greenwashing renewable energy and being deceptive about it and telling us how expensive it is. So I think that is what is hindering the process of moving to renewable energy, because of what we've been told that it's expensive, and I think that is greenwashing. And so Brian was talking about the crisis. So I think that the present economic order offers a bleak future with growing, poverty, failing services, and failing health, even degrading environment. So, I mean, in many communities, the mineral complex that we're talking about is not really beneficiating people who are living near the fence line of the coal mining and living near the coal-fired power station. So people are paying the cost. It's either with their health, and so we've seen number of people getting sick in the areas like Mpumalanga, in the areas in KZN, because of the history of our energy sector. It has never been made to benefit those poor people who are living in those poor rural areas. So it has been benefiting the elite, and then it has been benefiting those who can afford. If you cannot afford, we've seen that, especially women. Someone asked a question about where are women in this discussion. So the energy sectors and the policies that we are seeing in South Africa, it's not about the people on the grassroots level. The discussion is about for what. And then, so it doesn't cover the public and the poor people and those women who are working 6 hours a day to collect firewood, and which those places are already being closing down because there is no land. The land has been taken away by the mining companies. So the primary users, I think they're bearing the brunt of the cost, and then we've seen that how we've struggled to finish building Medupi and Kusile, and that has put South Africa into going and asking for more loans on top of the loan that they got from World Bank to build Medupi. And then the price of that is actually being paid by us, the poor people who are not the majorities of the users. So Brian was talking about that, and we've also seen that the system, even the poor people, the money that they have, it goes to food and it goes for housing, and so it's a struggle for the people to get energy. So that people, they are still remaining in energy poverty. Even though we have statistics that are saying we have 80% of South Africans connected to the grid, but even those who are still connected to the grid, they are still not affording to buy. They use paraffin and wood and all those kind of things, and this bear more the burden on women, as I've said before. So I think because we don't have time, I will stop there, but I just wanted to say that the economic, I think, of the energy sector is highly depending on coal, and that has been seen as a necessary evil for the benefit of growth. And it has forget that there is climate change and the carbon intensive, the emissions that are coming from this. So in South Africa, I think we all know that we have 3 priority areas in Gauteng and in the Vaal Triangle, also in Mpumalanga and Lephalale. And this is where we find most of these energy intensive companies or producing companies like Medupi and Kusile and all the power stations that we have that are actually contributing to the global warming and climate change that we are already seeing today, which we are failing to deal with. So I think I can stop there.
Okay, no, that's great, thanks. Do you want to, sorry, I should have said at the beginning, do you want to just explain who Women is? Because some people might not be familiar with Women.
So Women is African alliance aiming to unite women against the destructive resources extraction. So we're working here in South Africa and in other countries in Africa, and we are working on militarization and violence in the mining areas. We also have a campaign around fossil fuel, energy and climate justice. And then we also have a consent campaign, which is known as right to say no to big development. And I'm working on climate change and energy in South Africa.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. Okay, so let's open it. Yeah, to those people. Thank you. Let's open it up then for discussion. We've got about 10 minutes, and then we in that way we'll actually catch up a bit of time. So if open for questions, comments, I'm not going to distinguish between the two, either for to Brian's input or Caroline. Any questions about the dire state of the Africa's political economy? Okay.
Coming to, my question is just too short because I just want to understand something, especially with the Public Investment Commission. So if, let's say, the government allows all stakeholders to be part of the negotiations to ease ESCOM, not to loan money outside, and we use the Public Investment Commission money to avoid a lot of credit from ESCOM, as Brian was saying. I just want to impose this question to our members. Will it be necessary if we can ask the money from the PIC? And if yes, this money is not going to cause problem in the future for the employees.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions before I give that to Brian? Richard?
Yeah, maybe just to reflect on whether we have other terms than public and private, because as Sean identified, it's sometimes difficult to tell whether you're dealing with a public entity or private entity. ESCOM is a public entity, but it's taken a $33 billion loan from the Bank of China. It's spending loads of money for Hitachi to build, or work a whole bunch of companies to build Kusile. And, you know, when the cost of Kusile go up, well, that's for the public purse. So there's things that happen in the public sector which have got involvement in the private sector. And then, Brian, you were talking about the Public Investment Corporation, that's public money. Well, UIF, that's public money. Pension funds starts to get money, you know, the pensioners might start to have a bit of. So I'm just wondering if we have any other ways of trying to get past these two terms of public and private, which so much is hiding behind.
Okay. Any other questions, Richard?
This is a very short one, which I guess we sort of answered, but there have been various people, sort of commentators on the energy sector, saying, look, if ESCOM did get involved in renewables, at least ideologically that would help, because that they wouldn't be as defensive of coal, perhaps because they have another income stream. As Brian was saying, in their financial woes, is there actually any realistic chance that ESCOM can make a meaningful investment in renewables? So it's just a sort of a double-edged sword. Like, something we might want to discuss over the next day or two is, should ESCOM get involved in renewables, or can they?
Okay. Okay, then, now second I've got 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, no, I also want to ask Brian, because it's a bit confusing. I need just some clarity. We're talking about ESCOM that's having challenges, and ESCOM is a government outfit, and it's been running the show for now. Now, the very same government that want to do a new energy source is coming with IPPS. So is it it's not a conflict of interest? And two, on which interest they say the IPPS should take over the renewable energy and to restore, make new plants, and then what are they saying about ESCOM? ESCOM is still their baby, and it is the responsibility of the government to make sure there's financial stability. So what the plan just to do, try to separate the two and they understand. Yes.
ESCOM and government.
Yeah.
Okay. I think then Dingo and then.
Look, I mean, I want to put Caroline's hand back to the discussion of the next few days. The issue of, once we talk about the role of utilities in the transition, we should also spend some time on some of the problems that have arisen because of the form of utility that we have, which is ESCOM. Because if we're gonna be talking, Brian, about wanting to persuade unions and using PIC money, we have to talk about some of the challenges of vertically integrated utilities. We don't have time now, but I think over the next 2 days, because there have been real challenges. And I have a second issue, which maybe from the international experiences, Daniel was talking about UTE and being sort of a vertically integrated company. I mean, we had something here in South Africa about the establishment of a independent systems market operator, an ISMO, to deal with the sort of the dominance of one company, particularly if you're opening entrance to other publicly owned utilities, even at a municipal level. And ESCOM was in the forefront of killing that bill. Unfortunately, we as NUMSA suffered it, and COSATU was on the other side. We were still affiliated at that point. So I'm just saying, you know, when we look at these challenges and how we could even the question of democratizing ESCOM, because although we're talking about ESCOM as this thing that belongs to us, to quote Comrade Vati, but in many ways, the corporatization of ESCOM over the years has meant that there is little that is us, except the sort of legal and sort of ownership by the state. So as I said, I want to put this on the table, and so that we discuss it when we're talking about it, so that we don't end up here with a in defense of ESCOM campaign. My salary is still being paid. Some contribution from the ESCOM members.
Ownership on Nigeria.
Okay.
My confession is I'm not being paid by ESCOM at all. In fact, I have to pay ESCOM for various services. But I think that ESCOM is in extremely deep crisis. And what worries me and what I think we need to be mindful of are the deep crises in other emerging countries like Turkey, like Mexico, like Argentina, etc. You could carry on. There's deep meltdown going on in each of those countries, for sometimes different reasons. But if we look at ESCOM, is our task to fix a broken model, or do we need to exercise our skills and our imagination and our ideals to envisage a new version of a utility? I think we have to take the agency in that area. We can't leave it to government to redesign ESCOM for us. We can't leave it to capital to redesign ESCOM for us. We should be making the proposal about what we want to see, and we should be pushing for that. And we should be taking into account what Dinge is saying about some of the real crises that we need to discuss and a way forward.
Okay, Brian, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
I'll just talk a little bit to the PIC and a little bit about this debate. I like the saying, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I'm just suggesting that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So that I think we must value having a vertically integrated public utility that gives us a possibility of having alignment in strategy and policy and so on. It's not to underestimate, as you say, the huge crisis that we face in ESCOM, and not just the self-made crises as Dinge is referring to. I mean, there's so many levels of the crisis. One of the big problems and challenges that Eskom faces, of course, is the increased costs of coal. Those increased costs of coal have to do a lot to do with the international coal market, the opportunity of being able to export coal that previously Eskom had a monopoly on, the failure of Eskom to be in a position to invest, because that's what it did in the coal mines, which have now become themselves in crisis and need a huge amount of recapitalization. So the problem is very big and it's complex, and I don't profess to have a very clear idea. And I think the questions about what type of Eskom do we need is important, but I'm just saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We've got a reverse corporatization, so I think it's a very big problem that pushed Eskom in a particular direction. But we shouldn't forget that Eskom gave us or contributed to a great extent the problematic mineral energy complex itself. So just having a public utility doesn't mean that's the solution. It's what and how you use and direct that public utility, and that's why I would say that it is very critical for Eskom to be playing a role in driving a renewable energy sector. And I think the renewable energy sector is not just about building wind farms and solar plants, etc. It's about thinking about what kind of renewable energy industry is possible. Can we produce the blades? Can we produce all the inputs that we require? That means that we have to think about what type of trade policies do we need, because with the existing liberalized trade policies, where we don't have the possibility of protecting local industries, where we are subject to intellectual property rights regimes that don't allow for the transfer of technologies, etc., we're in a big problem. So I think there is, just to say in parenthesis, I think the climate catastrophe, the climate crisis can be quite a useful thing to imitate what the Treatment Action Campaign did in relation to compulsory licensing of generic medicines, when they went to the WTO and said HIV/AIDS is a national disaster. So why can't we say climate change is a national disaster and we don't have to be bound by the intellectual property regimes, etc. Something at least for us to think about. But I do hope that we do get into this debate about what does it take to build restructure a public utility like Eskom. Do we support the breakup into different component parts? Is that not just opening up the door to privatization, particularly the cherry picking of what is the most profitable, etc.? Just to say on the Public Investment Corporation, the unions don't make any decisions at the moment. Public sector unions make no decisions about where public investment corporations' monies are invested. So the Public Investment Corporation manages different funds, mainly the government employees' pension fund. Now, I can see Sanomzi looking at me as a teacher, a public employee. What happens is you are guaranteed, when you enter into a contract with the education department, they say, this is your salary, this is what your pension is going to be, etc. It's a defined benefit that you have. It's independent of how much capital is or assets are in the Public Investment Commission. Now, for various very bizarre and perverse reasons, this fund grew dramatically
from the time of the end of apartheid. And I can tell you a fascinating story about how it happened, where government put in huge amounts of funds into the government employee pension fund to change it from a pay-as-you-go fund to a fully funded system. Now, in order to put that money in, it increased its budget deficit, which it had to go and borrow. So it borrowed from the government employees pension fund in the form of state debt. So this thing grew and grew and grew and grew to the point that it has these surpluses. But the strange issue is, in spite of the shift that Brian Molefe did in directing money out of government bonds into the private sector and particularly into facilitating BE, returns on investment are roughly about 4 to 5%. So we're not talking about 12, 15% returns. Now, that is why, but if you look at what Eskom rate of interest that is borrowing at, it's well above 5%. It's 12%, 13%. So if it were to simply say, okay, we'll guarantee a return of 5%, which is currently what is happening, why would any unionist complain? Because then you're securing their pensions, you're securing energy supply going forward, etc. So on the, it's a debate whether Eskom should be a utility that is building renewable energy plants. Well, it is doing that as a condition of a World Bank loan. Unfortunately, it wasn't doing it in a very profound sense of strategy. So for me, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to have a public utility that is making additional investments into decarbonizing the energy sector, particularly as many of the coal-fired power plants are coming to the end of their lives. So what do we do now? Do we go and build new coal-fired power stations? Why not facilitate this transition? I think the point that Dinga makes about other public utilities and how they relate to Eskom don't foreclose the investing from coal into the renewable energy sector, but it must be done as part of a much bigger and deliberate strategy that allows us to the economies of scale such that we can sustain a local renewable energy industry. And that brings the point that Aisha made before we went to lunch, that can only be considered within a Southern African context. That is where the possibilities of economies of scale such that you can compete against cheap producers.
Okay. It's 20 to 4. Can I suggest that we actually break for tea now? Have a break now. I know because we've got one more session. So I want you to just get a little bit of walking around and drinking coffee and caffeine and stuff so that you can get to the last session. And I'm sure that a lot of the discussion can happen after, at tea time as well. So thank you very much, and we'll see you back at 4 o'clock. No, 5 to 4. 5 to 4? 5 to 4.
That's a bit precise.
Yeah. Well, let's make it at 4 minutes to 4, just to be even more precise. Now I realize 20 minutes tea, not necessary.
No.